Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome. This is Rabbi Ed Feinstein, joined this morning by my dear friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman, and this is Valley Beth Shalom, Torah study for a Shabbos morning. We're delighted to have you, Marc. Thanks for coming on.
I'm thrilled to be here.
And this morning, once again, we wish our friend Sherry Hirsch our very best. She's doing well. She's just taking a little bit of time for herself and her family now. This week, we begin the cycle of the Torah readings. Very exciting week because we rolled the Torah all the way back on Simchat Torah last week, and we initiate the whole cycle all over again. So this week, we read the stirring words of the beginning of the book of Genesis. Beresheet bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God creates the heaven and the earth, and the stories of creation, the great stories of who and what we are as human beings, how the world is to be put together, and what's the great task of being human in the world. Those are the topics of this Torah portion. It's a Torah portion that really deserves an entire year entirely to itself because so much occurs in this Torah portion, so many stories and so many challenging ideas. But let's begin with this one premise because both Rabbi Gellman and I are contrarians. We're going to offer a contrarian interpretation of the book of Genesis. Many of us were taught in Sunday school when we were young people that the great contribution of the Bible, that the great contribution of Judaism to world consciousness was the notion of ethical monotheism, the belief in one God who commands morality. And while certainly ethical monotheism is a key principle and a key pillar of Jewish faith and of what the Jewish people and Jewish culture has contributed to human consciousness, there's so much more here in Genesis. In fact, so much more that's even more important, or rather, shall we say, that's the foundation of ethical monotheism here in Genesis that we'd like to both comment on this morning. So let's begin with that question. Rabbi Gellman, if you can pick out one element of the great stories of creation, one element of the book of Genesis that you would put forward and say, this is the great contribution of the Bible, this is the great contribution of Genesis to human consciousness, what's it going to be?
That's easy for me, Ed. It's the week, the Shabbat. To me, that is the greatest contribution of Judaism, and it's a moral contribution, a ritual contribution. But I want to speak about its metaphysical contribution. It helps define the way the universe looks to us. Let me explain. When you think about the way people divide up time, there's two ways people divide up time. The first way, which is done by all native peoples and other religious traditions after Judaism, this way of dividing time is a way of dividing it based on what you see and what everyone can see. It's a natural division of time. So, for example, a day. You don't need a revelation from Sinai to know that there's a day. A day is one sunset to the next sunset, one sunrise to the next sunrise. The first people who crawled out of a cave and looked at the world and began to exercise their human capacities as thinking beings, Homo sapiens, they could tell that there was a day. It's a natural division of time. The second is a month. A month is a natural division of time because of the lunar month, because of the cycles of the moon. So from one full moon to the next full moon, from one new moon to the next new moon, doesn't matter which phase of the moon you pick as the beginning of the month, but from one to the next is a month. And 12, the next natural division of time is a year. So 12 of these lunar months, which any human could see and did see and divided up, was 12 of lunar months, and that's a year. So, and that would take you from one wet season to the next wet season, one dry season to the next dry season. It doesn't matter. What matters is that it's a natural division of time. Day, month, year. However, here comes Judaism, the first religion in the whole world, the first example of human thought. And it's so profound, so brilliant, so enduring, so transformative that this idea couldn't, in our opinion, I know, couldn't just be something we thought up. It had to be a gift from God to us. And that gift was that there is a week, 7 days. Now, if you think about it, what makes a week? Is there any natural indication in the world, in nature, that a week has passed? No. A week is completely and utterly and absolutely arbitrary, which means God intended the week to be a supranatural division of time, something that is beyond nature. And God did this and gave this to us so that we could learn the great lesson of the Torah, which is that there are two cycles of time going on in our lives and in the world continuously. The first is the natural order of time that I spoke of, the time that you can see with an unaided eye in the world. And the second is the order of time which is sacred time, which is defined by weeks and ultimately by groups of weeks and by holidays and by genealogies. And that cycle of time, the cycle that Rosenzweig wrote about so brilliantly and obtusely, unfortunately, in his great masterwork, The Star of Redemption, that Judaism is the master of this sacred time, that we as people, as a religion, are not really meant to live in the world of natural time. We live in sacred time. So for me, Ed, the great contribution of Genesis, the Torah, Judaism, and actually the pinnacle of human thought is to create the idea of a week, a sacred division of time that has nothing to do with nature.
All right, so, but let's take this one more step. So what is the implication of that? Or rather, let's put it in some concrete terms. What's the difference between the person who lives entirely in natural time or in nature, say the pagan, for example, who worships nature, who sees God in all the phenomenon of nature, of thunder and lightning and rain and snow and sun and heat, and the monotheist who says, I believe in a God who's outside of nature, is beyond nature? What's the functional difference in the way that those two lives might be led?
Well, the first is that there's a revelation in sacred time that you can never get in nature. And that comes to morality. In nature, you can never learn morality. You know, the rabbis wrote about how you could learn love and compassion from the mourning dove who takes care of the little baby doves. But that's really not true. The truth is, as the great poet wrote, nature is so red in tooth and claw. It is a place where the survival of the fittest, where lions eat antelope, where there's no moral calculus, the strong prevail, the weak are crushed. And in sacred time, we are capable of doing things that are against our physical nature. We want to steal something, but we don't. We want to violate our marriage vows, but we don't. We want to be cruel to others, but we aren't. We want to be selfish, but we are generous. All of these lessons of morality come from sacred time. And you have an idea, I know, of circular versus linear, which you taught me.
Well, yes. So my reading of the same idea, and I think it's a wonderful idea. So we live as natural creatures. We are natural. We are bodies in space. Our bodies are animal, as it were. So we live in the world of nature, but we're given the opportunity, rather the invitation, to live beyond nature as well. One of the indications of this is morality, as you said. I don't have to live the morality of nature. In fact, we call it humane when we live outside of the morality of nature. We consider it above the morality of nature. There's another way to think about it too, which is the question of what model of time we adopt. How does time look to us? Natural time is circular. It's cyclical. Day follows night, day follows night. Winter, spring, summer, fall. The phases of the moon. The circular time, if you apply that notion to human experience and say, I read human experience as circular in its basic structure, then you end up with this idea that we are all on the great mandala, the great cycle of being, and that history inevitably repeats itself. It goes round and round and never changes. And thus you get the statement in the beginning of the book of Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun. All the rivers flow into the sea, but the sea is never full. There's nothing we can do in that model of time to break out of the inevitable cycle, which means that every generation is fated to make the same damn mistakes the generation previous, and that all of us are trapped and nothing can ever be changed. Well, comes along the Torah and offers a different idea, offers a different model for the way that we experience history, the way we experience time. And that's linear, the line. The first word of the Torah is Beresheet, in the beginning. There's a beginning. And there's a belief in Judaism in kates, in an end. It's a line. What is the storyline of the Torah? It's a journey. It's a journey from the house of bondage to the promised land, from Egypt to Canaan, from slavery to freedom. The idea of the journey, which is a linear model, gives me the opportunity to think of history in a different way, that there can be progress and there also can be regress, that I can add something novel and new and move the line forward, move the march of history forward. Now, it has one huge disadvantage. The great advantage of history as a circle is it erases death. It erases death, the symbol of the phoenix that rises up and then is burned up, it dies, and out of its ashes it is reborn. All the symbol, including the great faith of Christianity, of the reborn God, or the man who was reborn as the God. The notion that death is only an invitation to rebirth. That's what's so attractive about the circular history. Linear history informs me that death is very real, and so it has a great deal of tragedy built into it. But it also gives me the possibility of living as an individual. Because if nothing is new under the sun, if nothing I can add to the flow of history, then basically I as an individual don't exist. I'm going to live a life that my father lived and his father lived and his father lived before that. And there's no such thing as a life that belongs all to my own. But if we're on a journey, then I can take the wisdom of my ancestors, the wisdom of my parents, and using that wisdom, advance the line forward, which is why I think we carry the names of our parents and our own Hebrew names. But yet we have our own Hebrew name. We add something, we move forward in the line of history. I think that's one of the other great differences and one of the other great revolutions that the Bible introduced into human consciousness, into human history.
Yes, I agree completely. And that idea of history means that we have a destiny. If you have a circular idea of time, and I think that's a brilliant insight, then we have no reason to do anything. We have no ambition. There's no destiny. There's no purpose. There's no goal. There's no idea of becoming liberated from where you are. You are constantly in the cycle. It's interesting that in this, the revolution is shown even more with even more power when you look at the context of the biblical story, which is the Babylonian creation story, and the rituals of Babylonia, where there was this great stepped pyramid, the Isaglia, and the high priest every Rosh Hashanah for Babylonia would go up to the top and sacrifice something, and an animal, and then would declare today is day one. Today is day one. And that was the world that we were born into, that Judaism was born into. And it said, no, this is 5781. Tomorrow, next year will be 5782, and on and on. So they got the number of the years wrong by a few 100,000 years. So what? Doesn't matter. The point is that basically we are moving forward. We're moving forward into history. And it also creates the challenge, which you mentioned, and I want to reaffirm, that you can go down. You can go down in history. That history isn't, as Hegel thought it was, a constant improvement and elevation of the Weltgeist, the world spirit, and that there's a constant rise in human freedom, hope, and so forth. That's just not true. Sometimes history produces Hitler, and history becomes a nightmare, and that creates the responsibility in each of us to alter history, to make sure that it is an upward, as Martin Luther King spoke so eloquently, that the arc of that history arcs toward freedom. And that idea is a Jewish idea. It's a Jewish idea given to the world. And I mean, I'm an environmentalist and I love animals. In fact, my grandfather was a zookeeper, and I have credentials in the animal world. But the truth of the matter is that the elevation of animals in some environmental writings, in some writing, for example, Peter Singer, who writes, the philosopher, used to be at Princeton, who thinks that animals have personhood. It's wrong. And it leads us away from the personhood of real persons and the elevation of the humanity of real people. And I understand that, because when you have a pet, when you have a dog, when you have a cat, something, it gives you a sense of complete joy and dependence, and people aren't always like that. So there's a challenge to have sacred time and natural time. Because, as you mentioned, we are natural creatures, and we are a combination of, we're basar v'dam, we're flesh and blood, but we're also b'tselem Elohim. We're the shadow, is how I like to translate tselem. We're the shadow of God, because tzel is the shadow. So those are my feelings, that Genesis begins like a rocket ship with its best and biggest idea. And then from there on, the whole thing is an attempt to work out the implications of sacred time.
I appreciate that. That's a wonderful way of reading it. I agree with you about animals. I mean, it's ironic that you're a rabbi and your grandfather was a zookeeper. You're sort of in the same business, I suspect, you know.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
We both have experience with wilde chayos.
There you go. But here's the thing, I don't disagree with you in your critique of Professor Singer, but I understand in some ways where that environmental moment comes from, because for so many generations and generations, human beings have seen nature simply as something to be exploited, as an object to be exploited, as a toolbox, or as a set of resources, and had no reverence for the life that exists in nature, for the complexity, the beauty, and the necessity. And what I think that the environmental movement is trying to do, and maybe it overstates the case, sure, but maybe it needs to be overstated, is to stop thinking of nature simply as that to be exploited. But
no, I think that's an important caveat. And I used it myself when I would talk to people about Save the Whales that I was involved with when I was younger. And I would say, if the argument is we should save the whales because they're a resource and we have to save the resource for the future, I said, well, what if they're a resource we don't need? You know, humpback whales swallow tons of sardines, millions of tons of sardines, which we could use to make a lot of Caesar salads, let me just say, and anchovies. But the truth of the matter is, if we see whales and other endangered species, not as resources, but as creations from God, then it's not our right to get rid of them, to abuse them, to exterminate them, to make them go extinct. That's not our right. Because again, from Beresheet, they are creatures made by God and blessed by God. You know, the birds of the sky are given the same blessing we are. Peru Uruvu. People think, oh yeah, that's a big human mitzvah. The first mitzvah, be fruitful and multiply. But it says that about birds. It says that about birds on the fifth day. So, you know, the truth is they're creations. But I agree completely. We need to have reverence for nature and reverence for the things of nature. But more than once, I've heard, I wonder if you have, people say, you know, Rabbi, I'm fed up with people. I like animals more than people. And I think that's just giving up on our destiny.
I can appreciate that, but I also can appreciate the person who says, "I've had enough with people." I think all of us have had that. We're watching the
Well,
news.
you're not retired yet, so that's
Yeah, thanks so much. I want to propose it. I want to propose a different rubric. I really appreciate what you presented to us. So, in the same spirit of contrarianism,
Yeah.
let me propose a second way of reading, of finding something in what I find in Genesis.
Okay.
You mentioned the Babylonian creation myth. So the story is that about 250 years ago, archaeologists discovered the storehouse of cuneiform documents, the storehouse of the documents of the Babylonian Empire. And among the many documents that they discovered, treaties and contracts, marriage agreements, and lunch receipts, and all that kind of stuff, was a set of tablets on which were written the great creation story of the ancient Mesopotamians that had been passed down from the Akkadians to the Assyrians to the Babylonians. And it was Abraham's bedtime story. It was the story that defined that civilization. And the story begins, in the beginning there were two, the great sky goddess Tiamat, goddess of the heavenly waters, and the sky and the earth god Ea, the god of the earthly waters, and they mingle their waters, and out of the waters came all the gods of all the phenomenon in the world. And very quickly the gods began to do what gods do. They began to fight among themselves, sun against cloud, and water against earth, and war against peace, heat against cold. And soon the world was filled with noise, and Mother Tiamat got tired of all the noise, so she determined that she would destroy all the baby gods. Mama is going to go to war against your kindlech, her kids. And the gods come to one of their own, Marduk, and they ask him to become the champion to fight against the fearsome mother goddess. And he agrees if he's able to be crowned king of the gods. And Marduk then goes to war. For several of the tablets, it describes the brutal war between Marduk and his mother. Understand, this is 5,000 years before Sigmund Freud, right? Son against mother. Finally, in the end, he props open her mouth with a thunderbolt and casts a second thunderbolt into her belly, and she dies in agony. He splits her in half, put half above us and half below us, which is why there's water that falls from above and water that seeps up from below. And the world is reduced to peace, and there's a big celebration among the gods. And then what happens ultimately is that the gods discover that it was Mama who did all the shopping, and they come and complain to their new king that there's nothing to eat. And so Marduk goes and takes of the mother goddess, the water, the blood of the mother goddess, and mixes it with the mud of the river, and creates a human being to serve the gods, literally, to create sacrifices that will nourish the gods. And that's the creation myth of the ancient Mesopotamians. Now, compared to that myth, look at Genesis. Genesis is frankly boring. It's majestic, it's reverent, but it's dull. There's no conflict. There's no passion. There's no sex. There's no violence. There's no war. It's just God rolling out reality. In the beginning, God created heaven and the earth was unformed and void, and darkness over the deep. And by the way, the word for deep is tehom, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Tiamat. She's still there. She makes an appearance in our story, but she's passive. She lays there quietly underneath the darkness, and the Ruach Elohim, the spirit of God, or the wind of God, hovers above the waters. Now, if there's nothing in the world yet, because nothing's been created, where'd the water come from? But I guess in the Mesopotamian myth, it's of the water that the world emerges. Same reference to that myth. And then God begins creating, and the creation has no conflict. Now, whenever I create something, I make challah, right? So every week I bake a challah. You know, I knead the challah and I form the challah, and there's always a conflict between me and the challah, right? I say you're going to be a challah, and the challah says, no, I'm going to be a lump. And some weeks I win, and some weeks the challah wins, you know, because the material of creation pushes back against my efforts. But that's not how God creates. God just says, Yehi or, 2 words, Yehi or, be light. In fact, there's no consonant in that phrase until you get to the resh at the end. Yehi is like God breathing reality. Let there be a separation between water and land. Water, again, being the goddess, so she's put aside so land can exist, so human beings can live. And then each piece of creation added to the next. Vegetation comes in. The sun, the moon, and the stars are put into the sky. Then animals are introduced, and then human being is brought onto the stage as the climax of the process of creation. And human being is given the mandate to be the partner of God in ruling the world and in creating the world. I want to suggest that the real burden of this is an answer to the Mesopotamian myth. You see, it's not that a myth is true in its facts. Myths are not true in their facts. They never were held to be true in their facts. Only very, very simple minds would read this literally. But they describe a world. And a world where the gods are always at war with each other means that there's nothing you can build that they're not going to come and ruin, which is a very sad commentary on what it means to be a human being. Right? You've ever gone down to the beach, to the shore for the beach for a while, stay there for a few days. You see this, you know, a gang of kids come down and they spend a whole day building sandcastles down by the beach. And then late in the afternoon comes the tide and washes it all away. And then the next day, a different group of kids comes along and builds the same thing, whole cities with turrets and towers and streets and avenues. And then the tide comes in the afternoon and washes it all away. And pretty soon you get the idea. The idea that the ancient Mesopotamian myth was trying to teach was that there's nothing that human beings can do which is ever going to really last. Nothing. It's just futile. It's an ethic of surrender, an ethic of resignation, an ethic of passivity. And in the face of that comes this biblical myth and says, no, the Bible has a very different idea. The world was set up so that you can dream, so that you can build, so that you can create. You are a partner with the Creator. You are a partner with the Creator in creating things in the world. And the most powerful phrase that's repeated over and over again is Vayar Elohim Ki Tov. The world is good. And it finishes Ki Tov Me'od. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't problems. There are lots of problems, lots. And right away, the Bible's going to give us problems. But that doesn't, but the fundamental metaphysical statement is that you are empowered as a partner with the Creator to dream and to build and to form a social world and to govern the natural world and to shape the existence that you would want to shape. And God says, I will show you how to do it properly. But ultimately, it's your opportunity, it's your choice. And you are empowered to be that shaper of your reality. And I think that empowerment of the human being and the responsibility that it carries, that is the great idea of the book of Genesis.
That's just brilliant and beautiful. I completely agree. The other word that comes in, of course, in addition to Tiamat, is Marduk, from which we get Mordecai. But it's more than that. It's the entire structure of creation that we borrow from the Babylonians. But as you say, it's not a myth. There is no myth in the Bible, because for a myth, you have to have a conflict of gods. You can't have mythology without a conflict of gods. And since there's only one God, there's no conflict. Now, because all literature requires conflict, this is another contrarian insight of mine. The Torah had to concede to the mythological world a little because it needed conflict in the Torah. And it couldn't get the conflict with another God because that's against our theological first principles. But the conflict came between human beings and God. We had a conflict because we were taught how to be free, but we didn't want to be free. This was Erich Fromm's idea that there's a kind of dialogue and learning when God creates the world this way, not with people who are servants of the gods, as you perfectly and beautifully said, was the Babylonian idea of our station in the universe. We are servants of God. We are slaves of God, actually. But rather that we are partners with God, that we are co-creators with God. And that idea is so profoundly different. It raises human dignity to a level that no other religious tradition had ever attempted to imagine. So on the one hand, let's face it, the Torah knew that the Babylonian creation story was what we would call today science. That's what everyone believed about how the world was created. They couldn't go to the stage of saying it's completely wrong. Rather, they wrote a myth, not a myth, but our story, our sacred story, that the world was created by God alone. But they still needed conflict. Literature needs conflict. Life thrives on conflict. And that, I think, is God's great lesson that it took God a long time to learn. That these creatures who you've created to be free and to have a destiny, a moral destiny, are weak because you've created them only partly as angels. You've created them partly as animals. And those animal instincts live in them and can dominate them. And that is the conflict that prevents us from becoming free and accepting our destiny in the face of God. So I think Beresheet is a challenge. It's a challenge to each of us to assume our natural human destiny and to struggle to freedom. And it isn't a story of the creation of the world back thousands of years. It's the story of the creation of our world, our life, on this day, with this breath, with this opportunity to exercise the challenge of freedom in what I will do today.
I would just rephrase your point. I think that the paradox, that the conflict comes in because there's a basic paradox. And the basic paradox is that when God says to us, you are a co-creator of the world, we understood that to mean we are also co-creators of ourselves. Unlike the animals, we're not programmed to be what we are from the very beginning. There's a certain degree of human instinct and a certain degree of inborn constituent character, but fundamentally being humans about making choices. And we cherish that choice. And so, as every parent knows, there's a fundamental paradox. I want my kid to be independent, but I want my kid to do what I told him to do. And God has the same paradox, right? I gave you independence. I gave you the freedom to choose. I gave you the impulse to want to be the creator of your own nature and your own character. And at the same time, I want you to do what I tell you to do, right? And that's why in the prophets, they have this fantasy that when God is going to put us back in Eretz Yisrael after the exile, he's going to take out that element of choice and put in an automaton. And the prophets said, it would be better to have human beings who did good things autonomically without having to be told to do them. But that's not who we are. And that paradox, it's called the paradox of individuation. to tell your kid, I want you to be independent, but I want you to be at the dinner table at 6 o'clock. That paradox exists in all of us. We want to be free. We want to make, and what's the Garden of Eden story? We rejected paradise because we wanted to create our own paradise. We want to be free. I mean, so you can give people the best of the best of the best, and they're still going to say, not good enough, because we weren't creators. We want to create our own paradise. That's the paradox.
Yes,
And
I
I think you're
agree.
right. And that's the paradox of that runs through the whole Torah. That's the great paradox of human history, right? The only disagreement I have with you, my friend, is I use a word differently than you word. It's just a definitional word. I use the word myth, not mythology, but myth, to mean a truth told in the form of a story. A myth is a truth told in the form of a story. And I think Genesis is a myth. It is our greatest myth, as we've both talked about. It sets out the great truths of Jewish culture, but it's told in the form of a story. And you're exactly right. The important thing about myth is that you don't read it in the past tense. It's not about something that happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. It's happening all the time. You read it in the present tense. We are all being created. We are all in process of deciding what and who we are. We are all deciding how to read the history outside and what to do with that history. And everything we've talked about today is exactly what the world is. So thank you for sharing today. Thank you for sharing your Torah and your truth. And I hope that everyone enjoyed a morning of contrarian Torah from two fellow contrarians on each coast of the world, of the country. We want to wish everybody a very, very good Shabbos. Of course, following our Torah study this morning, Shabbos services at 10 o'clock, and then at 11:30, our dear friend Rabbi Hillel Silverman with his thoughts on the weekly Parsha. This evening at 7 o'clock, I think, is Havdalah. And then every week every morning during this week, 8:30 on Sunday, 7:30 the rest of the week, morning minyan. In the evening, every night at 6 o'clock. And we're delighted that you're with us to learn and to grow and to be part of our circle of learning. Take care and stay well. Wear your mask. Stay healthy. Stay well. Take care.